The Differently Brained team acknowledge the traditional custodians of the lands on which we record, edit, and stream this podcast. We pay our respects to all First Nations peoples and their elders past, present, and emerging. We extend that respect to all First Nations cultures and their ongoing connection to the lands, waterways, and communities. Let's get into it.
Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of our lovely little program, podcast show thing known as Differently Brained. It's a podcast, by the way, in case I didn't mention it, where no brain is the same. And my name is Lachlan Rutherford.
And I'm Jacinta Dietrich. And every week I am just surprised and astounded by your intros, Lachlan, every time.
So am I.
This week we are having a wonderful chat with Alex Creece. Alex is a writer, editor, collage artist, and average cook living in Wadawurrung land. Alex's first book, Potty Mouth, is out now with Cordite Books. Hooray! Alex, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much for having me.
You've got such a fancy list there. Oh my gosh, you do so many things.
Oh, thank you. I think that it's not super duper fancy. Like, I think when you kind of simplify it to its elements, I'm just a person who likes writing and cutting things out and pasting things and, yeah, kind of being a little bit of a collector and a little bit, yeah, I think that it sounds fancier than it is.
A classic arts person answer, to be honest.
Yeah.
So to get us started, can you tell us a little bit about your identity or diagnosis that brings you on our show today?
Yes, totally. So my diagnosis is autism level 2. I also have an ADHD diagnosis, but I don't know how much stock I put into that personally. And I also have some mental health diagnoses. I especially struggle a lot with anxiety.
Right. And when it comes to not just the mental health areas, but also your autistic diagnosis, do you prefer to use person first or identity first language?
I'm happy with either.
Okay. Yeah, that's cool. We've talked to a couple of people, like we often ask this question when people come along on the show, and a handful of people have actually said that they are cool with either. It's definitely one of those subjective things for sure. With being autistic, what does that look like for you? How does that play out in your day-to-day?
I guess a big factor in my day-to-day is I like if days can look very similar to each other and have a specific kind of rhythm and routine and certain kind of, I guess, I can be quite ritualistic in the things that I do. And even just in like dealing with emotions or dealing with like sleep issues or dealing with any kind of issues, I often have a set way of dealing with things or going about things. So I would say that my days are very work focused and task oriented in a way where people often are impressed by the amount of tasks that I do. But I struggle with doing anything outside of kind of things that are within my interest. So basic tasks are very hard for me, like chores, preparing food, making sure I eat food, making sure I'm drinking enough, making sure I'm kind of looking after myself as a human is something that I find very difficult, even though I find it kind of enjoyable to, wake up and do my little morning routine and then get on the computer and work all day. And sometimes, people express like, wow, how are you able to do all these things? Like, especially like if you've got autism and all this other stuff going on. But yeah, something that I guess people don't see from me is the fact that when it comes to basic things, I have really poor abilities and not a lot of skills. And I especially really struggle with adapting to new or unexpected tasks. So I require quite a lot of support with changes. And if something happens that I wasn't expecting, I tend to respond quite poorly.
Hmm.
So yeah, my days are quite solitary in the sense of I do a lot of work alone. I obviously when I'm editing, I foster editorial relationships, so I am talking with other people. I work in teams and stuff like that. But when I'm doing my work, I'm very much in that sort of tunnel vision zone, and that's kind of my focus for the day. So like, yeah, I kind of actually interestingly got a similar kind of question with like NDIS application or NDIS planning, where they're like, what does your day look like? And I find it hard to answer. One, because, as much as I like to try to keep things as consistent as possible, every day is slightly different. And also because it's like, in terms of the task that I consistently am able to do, it's really just like wake up, do my work, and then not really much else.
Yep.
So I'm very fortunate that I'm able to work and that I have tasks that I enjoy doing. But yeah, I really struggle with kind of anything outside of that.
Hmm.
That is all so incredibly relatable and
Yeah.
almost, yeah, exactly how I guess I would probably describe my days and things. Like,
Yeah.
the eating, the self-care, stuff like that is so hard and something that so quickly slips my mind. But, I can sit down and work on my manuscript for 4 or 5 hours.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
there is that constant kind of confusion, I think, with the people around me that, I was always a perfectionist in high school. I took that into uni, stuff like that, where on the outside, I look like I've, most of the time got everything together and I'm really achieving the things I set my mind to and stuff like that. But there's obviously everything else going on in the background where I might not have eaten that day. Like I might
Yes.
faint at the
Yeah.
end of the day because I didn't eat and, Lucas wasn't home to remind me to eat. So I think there's, constantly kind of that weird disconnect in the way that people maybe see it from the outside and what it actually looks on a day to day. But the way you articulated all of that, every part of it, I was like, yeah, that's my day. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. That's it's really nice to be able to relate to other people on that, because it can be very hard to explain or get people to understand. Yeah, especially when it's like, I guess because of the way society is set up, where there's a lot of kind of people have certain ideals of like what is successful or what somebody looks like or what somebody should look like when they're doing well. And it's
Yeah.
kind of very much this belief that if you're working relatively well, that everything else is kind of fine, or like you must have a certain level of ability. But yeah, I know for me, I often will place my work and my tasks and my interest as like one of the only things that I can sort of consistently focus on and actually do. And I think another thing about that as well is, at least for me, how much it sort of gets wrapped up with my identity. Like if somebody's kind of like, wow, it's impressive that you wrote a book of poems, or like, wow, it's impressive that you work in this capacity. But then I kind of try to explain to people, this is the only thing kind of keeping me like emotionally afloat. Like I am putting all of my focus on this. And when things go wrong in this kind of realm of career or creativity or something like that, as much as I hate the word career, it is this sort of thing of like, it feels incredibly destabilizing to me, because
Oh,
it is one of those things where I haven't been able to rely on myself to consistently do a lot of basic tasks. I can't rely on myself to make a great impression socially or be successful in those kind of realms. So sometimes I feel like it makes me add even more pressure to myself in that sort of creative field, or the kind of work related field where it sort of feels like this is the only thing I can do, therefore I need to do it perfectly.
yeah. I think a lot of creative people get that perfectionistic streak. Like, I know that I do. I know that Jacinta does. You're right. Like, there is so much placed on certain modes of work that are quote unquote productive to society or whatever. And when it's creativity, it's often like pushed aside and not really valued as much. And when you do struggle to manage the perfectionism or the creative flow, then there isn't the amount of, I guess, support around that there would be in other areas.
And it's so compounded when, like you said, your work is a fundamental part of who you are and your identity and things like that. You know, if other people work to live kind of thing and they enjoy their career, but it's not what they're passionate about and it's essentially there to fund other things, you know, if there are elements of that change or are destabilizing, I'm sure it's hard, but it's not the same as, you know, getting a rejection when it feels like it's the only thing you're good at, it's the only thing you can do. I think that really really hurts that bit more.
Yes, absolutely.
So as a creative person, you do a whole bunch of different things, and a lot of your craft is drawn from your experiences as a queer and autistic woman with those mental health conditions. Can you tell us why it's important to create by drawing from those experiences and, you know, sharing parts of yourself through your art? I've read some of your poems. I love the stream of consciousness writing, generally speaking, but I found it particularly engaging with your poems. But yeah,
Thank
could you
you.
tell us? Oh,
That's
no
really
worries.
kind.
But yeah, can you tell us like why you find it to be so important to draw from those experiences?
Yes, well, that's an interesting question. So for me, I find that art and identity just kind of sit together as friends or something like that.
Yeah.
And even when I'm just trying to make a collage about, you know, the Muppets or like something ridiculous, or if not that the Muppets are ridiculous, I love them and they're perfect, and I love things that are ridiculous, so maybe they are ridiculous, but in a way that I like. But yeah, or like if I write a poem, even if it's about, you know, my dog or something that I think is not necessarily suggesting who I am or where I'm coming from as a person, I think there always is something that's sort of like, it's like telling on yourself when you make a piece of art, whatever kind of art that is. So I think sometimes it's important to try to be a bit okay with that. And I guess what I'm thinking here is when I was younger, and I don't want to talk about it too much, but when I was younger, I always felt quite self conscious about like being that person or like that kind of autistic kid or whatever. But despite my best efforts, I've just never been able to come across as being someone other than myself. And sometimes that gets me feeling very down. I get quite tired and I get quite overwhelmed thinking that kind of every day is going to be like this no matter what happens and no matter what I achieve, I'm always going to be myself and there's no reprieve from that. But I think that art can kind of be a good way, at least for me, of sort of leaning into some acceptance around that and some self acceptance of like my poems will always have a feel that they are related to me because I made them. My collages will feel like something that I have made because I have made them, and that doesn't have to be a bad thing, even though for a long time in my life I felt like things that reminded me of myself or things that felt too close to me felt uncomfortable or sad in some way. It's like if I can put it into a poem that somebody else can enjoy and connect to, that's really lovely. Or like if I can make a collage that is fun, even if I know the reason why I made that collage is because I could not stop cutting things out and it was all I could do. Like if the end result is something kind of joyful or something kind of interesting or something new, I think that's good, because even though I'll always be sort of same old Alex, it's nice to know that I can create new things out of that.
Yeah.
I don't know if that made sense or 100% answered the question.
Oh, it absolutely made sense. And it's a great answer as well, because you're right. Like, when you are creating art and putting yourself into it, and someone else is able to look at that and relate to it, and I absolutely did relate to a lot of the things that you wrote in. I ain't reading all that. I'm happy for you though. Oh, sorry, that happened. When I was reading that,
Yeah.
there were so many bits in there, like not completely, because my experience is different from yours, but even just by including some of the references, and also how those references made you feel, in particular, I was like, yeah, I'm connecting with this in a way that I probably wouldn't in any other capacity. Just
Thank you.
maybe just by talking to someone or whatever. And that's the transformative and, I guess, boundary crossing property of art. It's good.
Thank you. I really like that. And yeah, I definitely feel like art is a way of like reaching towards people, especially like in weirdness and like solidarity, in that kind of
Yeah.
sense of like, I'm gonna write a silly poem, and whoever like reads it and is like, that's interesting, or like, that's kind of cool, is probably somebody that is like, I might not have otherwise connected with, but is probably someone that I share some common ground with in a
Yeah.
nice way.
Yeah.
I think with art and things like that, it's a safe space to explore that weirdness as both a creator and a reader. Like, I think that was one of the things that really drew me to books and art, is that I did always feel a bit like the odd one out, and I didn't know how to manage that and manage the feelings around that. But it was through books and things that I engaged with those weird characters, and it became a form of self-acceptance. And now I try and write those autistic characters and neurodivergent characters and things like that, because I know how important they were to me, and that inevitably, like you said, a bit of me is going to slip into everything that I make. So I may as well make it intentional and make sure that I'm putting something special out in the world that might connect with someone else in a way that even if there's 5 seconds of that they can feel safe at home, kind of thing, maybe that'll help them to bring that into their everyday life and unmask a little bit and just be who they are.
I really like that. And yeah, I totally relate to what you are saying about reading, because it is this sort of situation where I do find it very hard to talk to people and to kind of know what questions to ask and know what's like okay to say or to ask other people. But it's like, especially if I read someone's personal narrative or like a memoir or something like that, or a poem, it's a really nice way that I can sort of get to know that person's story and sort of connect with them in a way that they have felt comfortable putting out into the world, even if I would probably find having a conversation hard sometimes.
Yeah.
It's just nice to know that, I guess with books, it feels like they're kind of in a dialogue with each other, or they're all kind of, reaching for each other in a way that's like, here's my story, and like, here's my story. And it's a nice way of being able to sort of have a conversation without having a conversation.
Yeah. That's a beautiful answer.
Thank you.
Speaking of books, can you tell us a bit about Potty Mouth, how it came about? What is it? Share all the things. Hype yourself.
Thank you. Okay. So I have been working on Potty Mouth. Well, it's hard with poems because you sort of just start writing poems and then eventually you realize you have enough poems that it's kind of a book length manuscript. But I would say that it sort of started, the first poems in the book would have started percolating around 2018 or so. And a lot of it came out of a practice of collage poetry, which is sort of like blending, I guess, the arts practice of collaging with a specific focus on words and rearranging words. So I have a huge amount of collage materials, both visual and there's visual and textual content in the collage materials that I have. And sometimes when I would struggle with writing a poem, just like going on the computer and opening up a blank page, something that I found really helped me was cutting out funny words and interesting words from magazines and kind of just placing them together, and especially taking things from mainstream media and media that I found interesting, whether in like a funny way or like a kind of morbid curiosity kind of way, or a critical way, and just kind of mixing words together and mixing different source materials together. So I have a few poems in Potty Mouth that use specific texts, but it was more that the practice of doing that kind of was able to help inform how I write poems more generally.
Mm-hmm.
So now something that I do is I do sometimes still use a collage technique where I'll take from source materials, but often what I do now is I'm kind of like random words that come into my brain are the source material, and I just plonk them all in a document. I plonk little phrases into a document because I tend to get things stuck in my head,
Mm-hmm.
or have like silly thoughts, or be, in altered states, and different things will come to my mind, and I kind of just catalog it all in a document, and then I revisit it later and sort of see what can be patched together from it. So I don't do all of my poetry writing in this particular way, but I definitely I'm not reading all that. I'm happy for you though, or sorry that happened. I wrote that one sentence per day. So it was basically just every day if I'd have like a funny thought or a silly thought or an interesting thought that had some kind of poetic stickiness about it, I would write it in that document. And then ultimately, over like a series of probably months or so, it became that big long poem. So that's kind of how it started. Something that I focused on when writing the book was writing poems in different settings. So obviously there are some poems in there that can very clearly tell were written in a hospital context. Some of them were written in social contexts or like after a social context. Some of them were written in an altered state, or something like that. So just kind of, I suppose, playing with different environments, different sensations, and writing in different contexts, I guess, is part of how it came about. And I think as well, like a lot of it is, I think that I'm someone who definitely wouldn't have considered myself a poet or thought about doing poetry in earlier years because I'm quite literal. I'm quite clumsy. I'm not the most I've got quite a weird voice, both in writing and when I speak out loud. So I think because of that, I always felt that poetry wouldn't be for me because I perceived it as something that was more for people who have that kind of delicate touch with language that I don't feel like I necessarily have. But I think after writing a few poems and getting good feedback and having good responses from writing poems as myself, I sort of wanted to write the book in a way that really leaned into those sort of characteristics and didn't apologize for the way that I express myself. So
I think that's such a big part of why I love your poetry, though, is because similarly to you, poetry is something that I had a very, very specific idea of what it is and, who or what a poet was. And I am also very literal. And I found that the fun and the whimsy and the way that you write your poetry and the way that I read your poetry was so much more accessible than poetry that I maybe studied in high school that I found really difficult to understand and really difficult to emotionally connect with, whereas your voice on the page and your voice talking to you today, like that is very engaging for me because it is familiar and relatable, I guess. So for me, I'm so glad that, you know, it's something that you found and that you do, because it's meant that now I'm not so scared of poetry, and now I feel like, oh, cool, it is something that I can read because you aren't that traditional, you know, what I found as traditional restrictive kind of poetry.
Yes.
I think
Yeah.
that's what makes you stand out. That's, you know,
Thank you.
you're very welcome. Just had to have a little hype moment for you. Sorry to interrupt.
No, I know, please. I was rambling, but I really, really
No, not at all.
appreciate that. And I do think that's something that I care about a lot in poetry, and something that I really value about poetry is that it is such a vague genre that,
Yeah.
but it kind of means that anything can be a poem if you say it is. So, yeah, I know lots of people who write poems, and all of them write them in incredibly different ways, and that can be very freeing. And sometimes, yeah, the kind of conceptions around the genre can make people feel like it needs to be intimidating, or it needs to be inaccessible, or it needs to be like highly academic or highly intellectual in some kind of way. But I think the more that people just have a play with a poem, and try to write a fun thing and see where it gets them is just kind of a nice freeing experience. And I think something else about poetry as well is like, sometimes I don't necessarily want to write like a full essay that explains everything and that says everything in a very specific kind of way, or I don't want to write a piece of fiction where I have to imagine characters or imagine new worlds. I find that can be hard for me. But with a poem, because nobody is really saying like this is exactly the form it needs to take, or this is exactly the form it needs to be written, I can kind of just have an experiment, and each thing is sort of its own little invention. And for me, that's an accessible way of being able to write and have fun with writing, which is really important to me. That I can kind of have a little bit of fun playing with a poem. It's nice. I like poems.
How do you know that you have enough poems for a collection? And does it need to have like a theme or something that holds them together? I think that's something that, because I've always been very much in the novel side of things or the nonfiction side of things, I understand how that works, but I have no idea how you put a poetry collection together, take it to someone and be like, here you go. Like,
Yes.
how many do you need? Do they need to link? I don't understand.
I will explain everything. Well, I don't know everything, but I will explain what I think. So basically, yes, the poem should have some kind of cohesion, or some kind of, they should make sense to sit together as a collection. Kind of how I would describe it is, if you were writing, for example, a collection of essays, the essays don't all have to be about the same thing, but generally there will be some kind of through line. Or if you are a musician and you make an album, generally there will be some kind of unity or some kind of theme that ties the album together. So I would say that a poetry collection is a little bit the same. That said, because poetry is so up for interpretation, it does kind of mean that if you can find a way to like weave those poems together and make them sit comfortably in a collection, and write an introduction and put subheadings to kind of indicate some sort of categorization or some sort of organization of the poems, then like it's really just a matter of like, yeah, convincing a publisher that these poems sit together. But even then, because poetry doesn't have a lot of rules, you could try to make a collection where things specifically are very disparate and are not making sense sitting together. So really, it just depends on how intentionally, I guess, it comes across. Because I think that a lot can be forgiven in art as long as it feels like it's doing what the artist has intended it to do, or that the artist is trying something a little bit different in a way that is fun. So, like, yeah, I'm saying that yes, poems generally in a collection will sit together in some kind of theme, but I'm also saying that if somebody was like, fuck you, I'm going to do whatever I want and make a collection that is completely rogue and has nothing to do with none of the poems have anything to do with each other. That's also a kind of artistic intention that, you know, a publisher could be like, hey, that's really interesting. But in terms of making a collection, I would say that like under 50 pages would be a chapbook and over 50 pages would be a full length collection. And it depends in terms of how many poems, it really depends on how long your poems are. So, for example, there are some full length books that are just one long poem, or there could be, if your poems are one pagers or like one stanza each, like it would take more standalone poems to fill up the book. But yeah, it really depends on what you're working with. But yeah, generally under 50 pages would be a chapbook, or like that's kind of considered like a smaller poetry book, and above that would be a full length collection.
It sounds like such a flexible and freeing form to work in. I think
Yes.
the way that it was taught to me was, yeah, that it was very restrictive and things like that. But then now talking to so many more artists and poets and writers who use poetry in many different ways, it's so much more flexible and exciting and freeing than I was ever taught. And I love that there can be a theme, or the theme can be that there is no theme, that there's a disconnect between each poem in the collection. I think that's just so interesting, and it makes me so frustrated that it was something that I wasn't taught, that was taught to me in a very different way than how I'm now starting to understand poetry. It's just like, it's exciting to, you know, be finding something new, but then I'm also like, oh, could have had all of this knowledge 10, 20 years ago.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of at least from my experience in like literary studies and stuff like that, is they sort of have this kind of idea of like you have to learn the rules before you break the rules. So in school they try to teach it in the very traditional kind of way, and sort of, yeah, have this idea that only once you reach a certain level of knowledge you're allowed to break those rules. But really, I feel strongly about just breaking the rules and like just having a go at doing the thing in the way that suits you. Yeah, I think that people won't want to experiment with a different genre if they first need to feel like they have to do it all like by a textbook or something like that.
Yeah.
And I think as well, like, in terms of like submitting things to publishers, you never know what someone's taste is and you never know what someone's going to like. So you might as well do it in the way that you like, because sometimes, like, publishers, it can get a bit more attention if you do something that is breaking the rules rather than making kind of something that follows a very normative structure. And also, like, as well with like self-publishing and other sort of forms like that, it's like I think it can be good to sometimes take away a little bit of that power from like gatekeepers. And I use that as a neutral term. Like, there are gatekeepers in the community of like, you know, who gets published and who doesn't, and those sort of things. So it's kind of like, I think sometimes too much stock is put into like, here's what publishers want, or here's what, you know, this particular authority wants. But, and I think sometimes that can take away the fun of just like creating and seeing what eventuates.
That's something that I've often missed because I haven't written anything. Jacinta and I used to go to the same university, and we both did creative writing, and I haven't done any writing since I finished university and did my honors. And the main reason is because I have this like all presiding anxiety about adhering to what's going to be acceptable to an audience or to a publisher or something like that, and that whatever I write is going to be not worth it. And I suppose like having the approach of just going and doing whatever the fuck you want and taking a chance can be an antidote to that. Do you ever experience, I guess, like anxiety about your writing and imposter syndrome about what you write?
Yes, I would say that I experience imposter syndrome about everything because on the inside, I feel like I have no idea what I'm doing at all times, and that is quite terrifying. In terms of writing specifically, I definitely have this feeling, especially after I've written a poem, and especially after I've written a poem that I'm even vaguely happy with. I get this sense that I'm never going to write anything good again. And I have that feeling as well. Like if I write an essay or an article or I get something published, I often have this feeling of like, that's the last time anyone's going to publish my work.
Yeah.
This is I've reached my peak or something, and it's all just I'm never going to be able to write anything again. But I think I've been trying to reframe that sort of thinking as rather than like entertaining it too much, even though it can be hard to get thoughts away from me. Something I try to do is reframe it as I probably just need a little break from this specific activity. And because the thing is, if I write a poem that I'm reasonably happy with and then immediately have the thought that I'm never going to write another poem again, if I then bring up a Word document or get out a notebook and try to force myself to write a poem, what happens next is basically going to reinforce that feeling of I'm never going to write a poem again, because the reason why I'm writing it is because I think I can't. So when I have that sort of feeling of like, this is the best work I'm going to do and I'm never going to do anything again, or like, it's all over now, for me, it just indicates that I need a little bit of a creative break and to take the pressure off. And I think sometimes, at least for me, that's collage can be really helpful there, because what I tend to do, because I like to have something to do with my hands, I'm just always cutting something out. And there's really only one way to cut something out. You can't really do it badly or not badly. Like you just cut. At least for me, because it's something that I've done a lot of and I just sort of get into a zone with it. So I find that for me, doing something creative adjacent that has kind of no pressure or no wrong or right way of doing it is a good way to stay creatively engaged without putting a pressure on myself that I need to have some sort of finished product ready and amazing. So and similar with if I'm feel like writing but I don't know what to write, sometimes just going and having a look at a document where I've written some interesting phrases or like potential ideas for a poem, and like organizing my creative space even can be a good way of engaging with a creative practice in a way that doesn't have a perfectionist sort of pressure on it. I don't know if that really answered the question, but basically, yes, I do get imposter syndrome, but I think I deal with it better than I have in the past. And I think sometimes I kind of feel like a bit of a goof, or like I feel silly, or I feel like I'm, not a real artist, or I'm not a good writer, or this, that, and the other. But it's like, you know, you two invited me on here to talk about stuff, and like, people have bought a copy of my book, and like, nice things have happened. People have expressed an interest in my work, so I'm going to try to hold on to that and try to, believe other people when they say they've enjoyed something that I've done, rather than use something I've done as evidence of the fact that I can't do it again.
That's really good advice.
That's a beautiful answer. You absolutely answered the question and went one step further and gave us all a bunch of tools on how to break those blocks and break that anxiety. So thank you. You went above and beyond.
Thank you.
We're almost at the end. I just have a few last questions for you.
Yeah.
It's come up obviously a couple of times because you are a collage artist. But when I hear collage, all I think of is probably a pretty basic fundamental understanding of cutting things out and sticking them down. And like, I don't know, I've never done it. And so I have, what is collage art is essentially the question.
Awesome.
What is it? How's it work?
Yes.
What's up?
So basically, collage is using any kind of found materials and doing some form of cutting or tearing and pasting so that things that don't necessarily belong together can now sit together in a particular art piece. So I have a lot of different collage materials from different eras. I have like some really old school like pornography magazines. I have like fashion magazines, women's weekly things and like cookbooks. I have children's books and little cartoons and comics and stuff like that. And basically what I do is I just sort of look for interesting connections and look for ways to take things out of their original context and place them in a new context in a way that I find to be fun or interesting in some sort of way. So something that I like about collage is that I feel that it's very accessible in the sense that like they're really, again, like with poetry, there aren't really any rules. You can make a collage that makes a political statement, or you can just sit down and be like, I want to cut out a bunch of pictures of dogs and then stick them all together and it looks really cute. So for me, collage feels like a very accessible sort of art form. It really appeals to me in being able to look at old materials, find little interesting details and little interesting things, and highlight them in a different context. I think as well, like I have a bit of a fascination with like trash and like thrifted objects and like things that are discarded. So yeah, often like the other day my partner was eating like Zappos candies and I was like looking at the packet, and every single time my partner would hand me the candy wrapper and I would hoard them in my little bag and be like, I'm going to make a collage with these candy wrappers. And it just sort of is able to make the world kind of invite the world into the art and invite art into the world, where I can just sort of see something and be like, I want that in an art piece, and I want that and I want to put it in a different context, especially like obviously a lot of materials that I have, especially older ones, are very like heteronormative and quite like sexist and stuff like that. So it can be really nice to sort of be like, all right, I'm going to cut out this 1950s housewife image and place her somewhere really fun.
I love that. And I love the way that those two art forms, particularly your collage art and your poetry, kind of feel like they come from, like from the outside, I would look at those as two very different kind of audiences and, you know, sections of art where, you know, collage is something that maybe most people only did in primary school and things like that, and then potentially never went back to, whereas poetry, as we discussed, can be very highbrow and very traditional and things like that. And I love that it feels like you've taken two art forms that are maybe on different ends of a spectrum, and the unifying thing is that you can break the rules and that you have flexibility, and the way that you work with both of them is just so exciting to me and has, you know, challenged what I thought about each of these art forms. And I'm like, yeah, duh, of course.
To be crass, it's punk as fuck.
Thank you.
But no, it makes so much sense because I had a very specific idea of what collage art was. It's not something that I've been exposed to very much. And so I had a very, very, to be frank, shitty understanding of it was, you just cutting things out and sticking them down. But I hadn't even thought that, of course, there's so much more to it in terms of the context of where the material came from and what you're putting it into, and that you can make a cohesive picture out of lots of different found objects. And I just love the way that you talk about it. It's just so passionate and lovely and
Thank
fun.
you. I
You're
think
welcome,
there
of
is
course.
some strength to sometimes, like you said, poetry is seen as highbrow or kind of, I guess, gate kept in like academic circles or something, whereas collage is kind of seen as more juvenile. But it is this sort of thing with art where it's kind of like whether something is meant to be reserved for like third grade or academia, I think you should be able to play with it if you want to play with it.
Yeah.
I love that.
So, last question we've got for you today, Alex. This is the question that we often ask all the guests that come on. What for you have been the best representations of autism that you've come across in your life? And that can be, any form of media, arts, books, movies, whatever, but also, resources as well.
Yes. That's a really good question. And I've written a lot about autism representation in the media. I would say for me, one of my favorites is still a show that has now been cancelled. It's called As We See It, and it's got 3 autistic individuals in it, and they all have different kind of traits and different presentations in a way that is very validating for me because I can relate a little bit to each of them.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's probably something I would want to see more in media is situations where there's not just like the one token autistic person. I think that does tend to put a lot of pressure on that person to represent a whole community or like that character to sort of like exemplify what autism is. So I think I would like to see more shows where there are multiple autistic characters, because I think that one, I think that's more realistic as autistic people often have other autistic friends. And 2, because I think it shows kind of more of a cross section of the community. And in terms of books, I've read quite a few autism sort of themed memoirs. I would say they're not 100% for me. So I think I would like to see autism represented across different genres and different forms. An autistic poet that I really like is called Bo Winden. He doesn't have a book out currently, but I believe that he is working on a collaborative book at the moment, and he also writes really amazing poems. So that's just someone within my community who I really like his work.
We're in the process of trying to get Bo on the show for listeners who are interested, and we just haven't lined up our schedules yet. So hopefully
yay. I love
before
Bo.
the end of this year,
Watch this
you'll
space.
have heard. Yeah, correct. Hopefully before the end of the year. Also, I just Googled As We See It, and it sounds absolutely brilliant. I am so disappointed that I'm only going to have one season to jump into because, like you said, it is so common that autistic people make friends with autistic people. So
Yes.
the fact that they're all housemates, I'm like, yeah, duh, of course. And what if the main characters has the same last name as me? So best friends, obviously. Definitely gonna go watch that. And we'll hopefully have Bo on the show. But those are absolutely fantastic answers.
Yeah.
And
Thank
I completely agree that, shows with more than one autistic character and things like that, there is so much pressure on one individual if you are the only autistic character in a particular show or medium that you're right. One person cannot represent a whole community, and it puts so much pressure on that one person to try and meet everyone's experiences, which I think just threatens to make it inauthentic. And
yes.
No, I loved your answers. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
And thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing just so much of yourself with us today. It was beautiful. You speak wonderfully. You're amazing. Everyone should go and get your book. Potty mouth, guys. Get it now. Alex is fantastic. Look her up online. Brilliant, wonderful human being.
Yes.
Thank you both so much. I really
Thank you.
appreciate it. Thank
Not
you
a
so much
problem.
for having me. You're both wonderful.
You're so welcome. And guys, we'll see you guys next week with another interview, probably.
Hell yeah. Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye. Differently Brained shares the opinions of individuals and does not consider your personal circumstances. Differently Brained exists purely for information purposes and should not be relied on as health or medical advice. Because no brain is the same, please consult your healthcare professional for your personal medical needs.